Rex is on life support, and they've been in administration since mid-2024 after their disastrous attempt to take on Qantas and Virgin in the big jet market. Medium jet market. They're still flying, but they're a fraction of what they used to be. So how did Australia's biggest regional airline end up here? What went so wrong? And is their future in the hands of a new buyer, or are we about to see Australia's newest government-owned airline? Who knows, but right now I'm in Coffs Harbour. In about 4 hours, I've got a flight to Sydney on Rex on one of their few remaining regional routes. Let's go check that out and dive into everything Rex. To understand the Rex story and their ultimate demise, we need to, as usual, go back in time. But how far do we go back? Well, 2002 kinda works. That was the year that Rex was created. It was spawned out of the collapsed Ansett Airlines. But I'm going to start by going back even further here, because the story of Ansett and the history of aviation in Australia is just quite interesting in and of itself. So let's fly through it now. The Wright brothers took their first flight in 1903, but commercial aviation really started in Australia in 1920 with the formation of Qantas. Between 1920 and the start of World War II in 1939, Australia was one of the world's leading centres of aviation. Despite having a population of only 7 million, which would have put it as the 29th most populated nation on Earth, it was ranked 6th in the world by scheduled available air mileage. And the Australian aviation industry was growing at twice the global average. Why was this island such a hotspot for aviation? Well, we're a country that stretches over vast uninhabitable lands. Flying is a pretty great way to get around. The government of the day recognized this and encouraged the industry through direct subsidies and airmail contracts. In the years leading up to World War II, the late 30s, over half of all air passenger and freight miles were in some way government subsidized. The industry was rife with entrepreneurs. At this time, there were 16 independent airlines operating in Australia. I won't go through them all, but let's focus on 3: Qantas, Ansett, and ANA. This is not the Japanese ANA, but Australian National Airways. Qantas, we all know them at this point. They started in Queensland in November of 1920. They started out operating taxi flights, joyrides, and government-subsidized airmail services. They were the first airline in Australia and are one of the longest continually operating airlines on Earth. They've been a relatively big player since the beginning. Ansett didn't actually start out as an airline. In 1931, Reginald Ansett started a service car operation, Ansett Motors, in country Victoria. He literally started with a single car and would drive people and stuff around. By 1935, he had quite a nice operation. He had a small fleet of cars and was operating a network of routes between towns in Western Victoria. This business caused a problem though. His success started to threaten the revenue of the state-owned Victorian Railways. This led to the Victorian state government, primarily their Minister for Railways and future Prime Minister of Australia, Robert Menzies, to introduce legislation that prohibited service cars from competing with the trains. And this effectively devastated the Ansett Motors business overnight. Reg, who was an enthusiastic private pilot, came up with an ingenious response. He recognized that aviation was under the constitutional control of the federal government and thus beyond the reach of state legislation. So he founded Ansett Airways in 1935. This was a calculated circumvention of this new regulatory obstacle. His first air service between Hamilton and Melbourne commenced on February 17, 1936, using one of these, a Fokker Universal. Ansett, the airline, grew from there into a nice regional carrier in Victoria, but it wasn't a big-time player, at least at that point. Australian National Airlines has its origins in the shipping industry, and their story revolves around 2 brothers, Ivan and Victor Holloman. The Holloman family ran a relatively major shipping company in Tasmania. At the time, the shipping industry in Australia was basically a cartel. There were monopoly agreements among all of the shipping companies, and as part of these deals, the Hollomans were limited in where they could carry passengers. They could move freight between the mainland and Tasmania, but not people. They were only permitted to move passengers around Tasmania. In March of 1932, Flinders Island Airways was started by Laurie Johnson and began flying between Launceston and Flinders Island, directly competing with the Holloman ships. Ivan and Victor resented this intrusion on their business, and while Victor was a trained pilot, so they decided to start competing. They bought a plane and started operating on the exact same route. They quickly realized that it would be more effective to join forces with Johnson and his Flinders Island Airways, so they merged with this airline to create the Tasmanian Aerial Services. This was soon renamed to Holloman's Airways, and with the financial backing of their shipping empire, they began rapid expansion. This flying business wasn't bound by the same cartel-like agreements that limited the shipping business, and the other shipping companies started to take notice. 5 of the biggest shipping lines invested in this new airline in the mid-1930s. This enabled Holloman's Airways to expand further. In 1936, they merged with Adelaide Airways, another upstart airline based in, well, Adelaide, and they went on to rename themselves Australian National Airways. Quick note here about the Hollamans: the airline was started by the brothers Victor and Ivan, but Victor unfortunately died in a plane crash. Ivan became the driving force behind this airline for years to come. With the backing of many of Australia's major shipping firms, ANA would become a major early player in the Australian aviation industry. World War II shook up the market though. Civil aviation was sacrificed for military needs. Qantas had 10 planes in their fleet, and most were used by the government for war service. By the end of the war, 5 of these planes were wiped out by either accidents or enemy action. Ansett, who wasn't a major player at this point, suspended all but one of their services during the war, and instead focused on performing engineering work and charter flights for the US Army Air Corps. By the end of the war, the tiny Ansett had grown into a major organization, employing around 2,000 people. But they had a problem. Once everything had wrapped up, they were flush with cash but struggled to restart their air routes, as these had been quickly taken over by ANA. So how did ANA fare during the war? Well, they had 4 planes requisitioned by the government, but they kept 19 in their fleet. They operated a network of services around Australia on behalf of the war effort, mostly transporting American military forces. This meant that they emerged from the war with planes and cash, and this led them to be the dominant airline in Australia post-World War II. But this is where we have to get into Ben Chifley and the government's attempts to nationalize air transport in Australia. Chifley, a more left-leaning Labor politician, became Prime Minister of Australia in July of 1945 following the death of John Curtin. He would go on to win re-election in 1946, just as World War II was coming to an end. Chifley's government was deeply influenced by socialist ideals and held the belief that air transport in Australia should be a public service, like hospitals, railways, or the post office. They wanted to turn the aviation market into a government monopoly. So, in August of 1945, just 2 days after the end of World War II, the Australian Parliament passed the Australian National Airlines Bill. Crucially, the bill contained provisions designed to create a government monopoly. But how? It first laid out plans for the government to start a state-owned airline, but it also declared that the operating licenses of private airlines would be allowed to lapse for any routes that were deemed to be adequately serviced by this new government carrier. Effectively, over time, the government would take over all of the privately operated routes. The primary target of this legislation was Australian National Airways. By the end of the war, ANA had a virtual monopoly on the major capital city routes and received the vast majority of government airmail subsidies. The Chifley Doctrine was clear. The future of Australian aviation was to be a single state-owned enterprise. This move to nationalise the airline industry was met with immediate and fierce opposition. ANA obviously wasn't very happy. Their entire existence was being threatened, so they mounted a legal challenge. They were backed by the broader business community and the opposition Liberal Party. The case was brought before the High Court of Australia and became a landmark test of the federal government's powers under the Australian Constitution. ANA's legal argument centred on Section 92, which states that trade, commerce, and intercourse among the states shall be absolutely free. They contended that the government's attempts to create a monopoly by refusing to renew the licenses of private operators was an unconstitutional restriction on this freedom of interstate trade. In December of 1945, the High Court delivered its verdict. In a pivotal decision, the court ruled in favour of ANA. The government couldn't use their powers to legislate a monopoly. But, very importantly, it ruled that the Commonwealth government did have the constitutional power to establish and operate their own airline. The Chifley government was forced to pivot. However, if it could not eliminate the private sector, it would create a state-owned enterprise powerful enough to compete with and discipline the dominant private player. This led to Trans-Australia Airlines, or as we probably all know it, TAA. TAA commenced operations on September 9th, 1946, with a flight between Melbourne and Sydney. It was well-funded, professionally managed. Its first general manager, Lester Brain, incredible name, was recruited from Qantas, and they were equipped with modern aircraft, positioning it as a formidable direct competitor to ANA from its very first day. In the following year, 1947, Chifley's government completely nationalised Qantas. Its operations were swiftly reorganised, with its domestic network being transferred over to TAA. And this move solidified the new structure of Australian aviation. Qantas was now the wholly government-owned international flag carrier, while TAA was the government's champion in the domestic market, poised for a head-to-head battle with the established private giant ANA. And boy, was it a battle. Over the following years, ANA was pushed to the brink of bankruptcy, but salvation did come in the form of an election. In 1949, Chifley was defeated by the Robert Menzies-led Liberal Country Coalition in a landslide federal election. It was expected by ANA at the time that this new, less left-leaning Menzies government would close down TAA. They had strongly opposed the formation of it. They were on Team ANA during the legal battles, but there was a problem. TAA was a roaring success. The federal government was benefiting from excellent dividends. All of a sudden, the Menzies government was quite reluctant to make such drastic moves. They were still ideologically committed to preserving a private enterprise presence in the sky. So, in 1952, they engineered a solution that would define the industry for nearly 40 years: the two airlines policy. Under this policy, only two airlines were allowed to operate flights between state capitals and between capitals and nominated regional centres. In practice, these airlines were TAA and ANA. They were handed a legal duopoly over the Australian aviation market. So now Ansett, how do they fit into this picture? How did they become a major player? Well, whilst this was all happening at the federal level, Reg was growing his airline methodically by focusing on budget fare interstate operations, carving out a niche that the two larger carriers often overlooked. He also diversified his business interests, building an integrated transport and tourism conglomerate that included Ansett Pioneer Coaches, Ansett Freight Express, and even hotel and resort operations. In this high-stakes contest between ANA and TAA, Reg Ansett and his Ansett Airline was a formidable third player, patiently waiting for an opportunity to ascend to the top. And that opportunity arose in the mid-50s. ANA had their protected duopoly, but was still suffering in the battle against TAA. The relentless pressure from its state-backed competitor had driven the once dominant ANA to the verge of bankruptcy. The only thing keeping ANA in the fight was Ivan Hollyman, one of the two brothers that started the whole thing. And well, when he died in 1957, the shareholders, the shipping companies, they wanted out. They first tried to sell to the government, but they declined. So in walked Reg. He had a significantly smaller airline, and his initial offer was rejected. The ANA board was skeptical that he had the required financial backing. But after he proved that he did have major backers, including the Shell Oil Company, and well, he got the government itself to provide financial guarantees, he was able to secure the deal in October of 1957. For a grand total of £3.3 million, Australia was still on pounds back then, Ansett became Ansett ANA. And this was the true beginning of this next government-mandated duopoly structure that would dominate the Australian skies for the next 4 decades. Ansett had the backing to properly exist in this controlled structure. They could pseudo-compete with TAA. That being said, not a whole lot of true competition was taking place. The government was the ultimate arbiter of the market, exercising strict control over all of the key levers of competition. Let's quickly run through how this all worked. In terms of routes, only Ansett and TAA were licensed to operate flights between the big capital cities in Australia, and all of their airfares were set by a government committee. There was no price competition. The airlines were also required to coordinate schedules, and this resulted in a phenomenon known as parallel scheduling. Both airlines had flights that would depart for the same destination within minutes of each other, limiting consumer choice. But perhaps the most powerful government tool in their regulatory arsenal was their control over aircraft import licenses. The government used this power to enforce fleet commonality, ensuring that neither airline could gain a decisive advantage through the acquisition of superior aircraft. The most famous demonstration of this power occurred in the late 50s. TAA, continuing its role as a technological leader, placed an order for the advanced French-made Sud Aviation Caravelle, the world's first short-haul jet airliner. Reg Ansett, concerned about his airline's ability to finance an equivalent jet fleet, successfully lobbied the government to block TAA's purchase. As a result, both airlines were instead directed to purchase the American-made Lockheed L-188 Electra, a less advanced but still powerful turboprop aircraft. This intervention delayed the introduction of pure jet aircraft into the Australian domestic market by several years, but encapsulates the policy's core principle: parity at all costs, even at the expense of innovation. This regulated period led to strong, almost guaranteed profits for both airlines, but limited their ability to expand, at least in the aviation business, so they went into other industries. Ansett, more specifically here, became a sprawling conglomerate under Reg's leadership in the 70s. They had the road freight business, the coach business, but they also sold package holidays, and heck, at one point they even owned a golf cart manufacturing business and a television station. Reg ruled over his empire like a king, and kind of lived like one too. He would famously take a helicopter to work every single day from his estate at Mount Eliza to the Ansett offices in Melbourne. A remarkable thing to do in the days when few Australian CEOs even had chauffeured cars. It's probably worth mentioning some of the controversies around old Reg. He was a bit of a raging sexist. He once described stewardesses over 30 as old boilers and claimed that women were unsuitable to be pilots because of their menstrual cycles. Yeah. Towards the end of the 70s, Reg's control of the empire started to weaken. It had made a disastrous investment into a finance company, Associated Securities Limited. When this collapsed in 1979, this was one of Australia's largest corporate failures and left Ansett exposed to losses of approximately $18.5 million. This was the catalyst for a takeover battle. Bids came in from various parties. Ampol Petroleum was a serious contender, but transport giant TNT and News Limited won out in the end, both acquiring equal 50% stakes in the airline conglomerate. Why did those two want Ansett though? For TNT and their founder, Peter Abels, they mostly wanted the air network. They had extensive road and sea operations, but they lacked a presence in the sky. Ansett also had its own trucking business, so this would eliminate a competitor. For News Limited and Rupert Murdoch, this was both a diversification move. The stable, regulated airline industry would provide a solid counterbalance to the volatile media market, but it was also a move to get control of Ansett's television business. Without getting into the complicated media ownership laws in Australia, Murdoch had a newspaper empire, but he wanted in on the television game. TV stations at this point were still somewhat regional. Just before the Ansett acquisition, Murdoch bought a stake in Sydney's Channel 10. And once the acquisition was complete, he merged Ansett's Melbourne station with the Sydney station, and this created Network 10 that we know today. Somewhat ironically here, after all of this, he became a US citizen in 1985. And again, due to Australia's complicated media ownership laws, he was then obliged to dispose of his television networks. But let's go back to 1979. The Ansett empire is now under the control of TNT and News Limited. And they, basically, in hindsight, just mismanaged it. They saw the domestic market as a cash cow and were not disciplined airline operators. In a bit of a throwback to my last video and some of the union-busting moves made by Alan Joyce, Ansett has maybe the perfect counterexample here of letting the unions have just a little bit too much power. In 1980, they placed an order for 5 brand new Boeing 767s. Now, the Boeing 767 was designed to be operated by 2 pilots. This was meant to be Boeing's first wide-body jet that didn't require a flight engineer. This is that person that sat behind the 2 flying pilots and monitored the complex aircraft systems. Computers were getting good enough at this point to do most of this job, but during the plane's development process, there were general safety concerns around 2 crewed wide-body jets. And well, unions worldwide were pushing hard to keep 3-person cockpits. Out of extreme caution, Boeing initially started assembling the first 30 jets with 3 crew flight decks. But after the FAA ruled that 2 pilots were indeed safe just 11 months before the first delivery, Boeing converted all of the in-production jets to 2 crew cockpits. Well, almost all, because here's the cockpit of an Ansett 767. Notice anything? Yeah, they've still got a flight engineer. Ansett was the only airline in the world to operate 767s with this 3-crew configuration. Not due to Australian safety concerns, not due to Ansett's own safety concerns, but due to the unions. In order to avoid a strike, Peter Abels, who was running the airline at the time, agreed to flight engineers on the 767s. If we zoom out here, the Protected 2 Airlines policy was allowing Ansett to become a bloated mess. And this all came to a head in 1987, when the Australian government finally voted to end the 2 Airlines policy and deregulate the industry. Ansett and TAA, or Australian Airlines, they've been renamed at this point, would now have to compete with not just each other. Ansett made some moves to prepare itself for this new world. They rebranded, bought a regional competitor, organized to lease 747s so they could start international flying, but in the end, the mess was too great. I covered this period rather extensively in my last video, so go watch that if you haven't already. But in the 90s, TNT and News Corp wanted out, and the whole airline ended up selling to Air New Zealand. This deal was a mess, and they ended up going under in 2001. Days after 9/11. So we've got a collapsed Ansett, but how does Rex fit into this picture? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but first, let's get to the airport. That's the vibe of this airport. Not much going on. Oh, thank you. I swear I do want to get to Rex, but I want to quickly touch on some of the chaos that came out of the Ansett administration process. Let's start with the administrators themselves. I'll keep this fairly surface level because I am by no means a lawyer. When Ansett entered voluntary administration, bankruptcy protection for our international viewers, after some back and forth, Arthur Andersen, one of the world's largest audit consulting firms at the time, was appointed to deal with this process. A very important note here is that 2 specific Arthur Andersen partners, Mark Corder and Mark Mentha, the 2 Marks, had legal control of the airline under Australia's voluntary administration rules. Here's the thing with Arthur Andersen. The whole firm imploded in 2002 after they were found to be heavily complicit in the Enron scandal. They were the auditors for Enron, and they had basically turned a blind eye to the accounting fraud that was occurring. But they were also found guilty of obstruction of justice for shredding documents and deleting emails related to the Enron audits once an investigation came to light. Crucially here, for the 2 Marks, because they had been personally appointed by the courts as administrators, when Arthur Andersen went under, they simply resigned from the firm and spun up their own firm, Corder Mentha, to continue their Ansett work. Corder Mentha is now a fairly large and successful advisory and investment firm in the Asia Pacific region. Let's quickly touch on their work with Ansett. The 2 Marks did briefly get Ansett back in the sky. Between October of 2001 and March of 2002, Ansett 2.0 ran a limited service between the major Australian capital cities. The whole purpose of this display was to attract potential buyers. But who would dare touch this financial wreck? Well, there was a couple of potential bidders. First, there was Anstar. This was headed up by Ansett's ex-CEO Graham McMahon and Michael Jones. Remember that name. Jones had run Raytheon's Australian arm in the late 90s. This consortium was backed primarily by the Ansett staff that were all now out of a job. This bid never gained serious traction as they were not able to raise the required funding. The second bidder, and most serious, was Tesna. This was a consortium primarily funded by Melbourne-based businessmen Solomon Lew and Lynn Lindsay Fox. Lou is a billionaire that made his money in retail, and Fox is the founder of the Lynn Fox Logistics Company. They had the financial might to pull this off, and their plans involved creating a whole new Ansett from the good parts of the old business. This bid was so serious that a management team was starting to be assembled. A catering company was selected. They even had a CEO of this proposed new airline. This CEO was James Hogan. Yeah, he would later go on to run Etihad. In late February 2002, without any prior warning, Fox and Lou withdrew their bid. But why such a dramatic exit? Well, it was later learned that they withdrew because they received no financial support from the government. At this point, with no other saviors and no realistic chance for Ansett's administrators to be able to revive the airline on their own, the airline was once again and for the final time grounded on March 4th, 2002. It soon became clear that Ansett would be spun out for parts, and this led to investment bankers and consultants across Australia and, well, the world jumping for joy. You see, Ansett as a whole was a basket case, but inside there were still good businesses. Two of those were Hazelton and Kendall Airlines. Kendall was a regional airline founded in 1967 by Don and Eilish Kendall. It started as an air charter provider and flight school, but grew into being one of Australia's largest regional carriers by the late 1980s. They were the first operator of the Saab 340 in the Southern Hemisphere. The Saabs will be very important shortly. And in 1990, Don and Eilish sold Kendall Airlines to the TNT News Corp group, the owners of Ansett at the time. Hazelton was a similar story. It was founded in 1953 by Max Hazelton and started with just charter services. Over the next 3 decades, they would move into freight, aerial agriculture, and a passenger service, becoming one of the nation's largest regional operators in the 80s and the 90s. They were also a major operator of the Saab 340. In 2001, Hazelton became a takeover target in a bidding war between Qantas and Ansett. Ansett won out in March of 2001, but both airlines were dragged into administration with Ansett's collapse in that fateful September. The idea of resurrecting these two good regional airlines was front and center for Darren Dugan. At the time, he was a consultant at Bain. His idea was simple. Both Hazelton and Kendall had been profitable, well-regarded carriers in their own right, with complementary networks and common aircraft types, the Saab 340s. He figured if he was able to acquire both and merge them, then there might be a good business here. He picked up the phone and he called Michael Jones, one of the two guys that headed up that Anstaff bid for Ansett. Together, they spun up a consortium in 2002 named Australia-Wide Airlines to acquire the Hazelton and Kendall assets from Ansett. They raised funding from Australian and Singaporean investors and began negotiating with the two marques. After months of intensive negotiations, the deal was struck on July 11th, 2002, leading to the creation of Regional Express, or Rex. Rex's inaugural flight took place on August 2nd, 2002, operating from Wagga Wagga to Sydney. The airline initially struggled. They burned through their starting capital in the first year and posted a $30 million loss. They needed more money, but almost all of the existing shareholders were not interested. I mean, fair enough. This thing was a cash-burning machine. But I say almost all here because this is where we get to Lim Kim Hai and Lee Tian Su. These two were Singaporean businessmen and were the two biggest founding shareholders. Together, they contributed around 35% of the capital to get Rex in the sky. They threw their money in on the premise that this would be a passive investment. They weren't actively involved in the airline. But when it became clear that Rex was about to go under, they came in, investing more of their own capital and took up the challenge of running the airline. Michael Jones and Darren Dugan were out, the Singaporean saviors were in. They would fly in for a week every month to oversee the business, and the recovery was slow. But at the end of their first year of leadership, Rex turned its first profit of $1 million. From then on, the airline was in business. Proper business. They were profitable, and we can skip over most of this period between 2003 and 2019. It was mostly happy days. They went public on the stock exchange, they expanded their route network, they acquired a few of their competitors. They'd forged a nice, profitable niche in the Australian market. With that all being said, there's a couple of things that we can touch on from this period. Firstly, I want to mention the way they did conduct their business. They're often seen as the airline that's from the country and for the country, but it's not all sunshine and roses. They also have a long history of playing hardball with local councils. On many occasions, they've threatened to pull routes or cut jobs when local councils would propose any sort of tax or fee increase. A couple of examples of this include Mildura in 2018. They cut their Sydney to Mildura route after the airport hiked fees, and they publicly called this a blatant money grab. There's also the case of Dubbo. They threatened to cut their Sydney to Dubbo service and sent out scathing notes to households in the region after the council proposed an increase in airport fees. So yes, deep down, there's still a business in the ruthless pursuit of profit. But secondly, from this regional airline era, I think it's worth also talking about their planes. Rex started flying with both Saab 340s and Fairchild Metro 23s. These came from the old Hazleton and Kendall operations, but they pretty quickly standardized on the Saab 340, phasing out the Fairchild Metros in 2006. These 340s suited their operations to a T. They seat up to 36 people, which is perfect for the small country routes Rex thrived on. But there's also a regulatory factor here too. Under Australian aviation requirements, domestic flights do not require security screening for aircraft that seat less than 40 people. For Rex, this was perfect. It meant fewer fees, faster turnarounds, leaner staffing, and on these thin routes, these are the sort of things that really add up. But also at the time, these planes were cheap. Saab stopped production of them in 1999, but throughout the early 2000s, there was a deep global used market, meaning airframes and parts were readily available and affordable. Rex took advantage of this and became the largest global operator of the type. The 340s were perfect, until they weren't. We'll get to that shortly. We first need to dive into their attempt to take on the big boys, their foray into the big jet market. But let's first get on one of these Saab 340s. Let's go and get on a Rex flight.
Thanks, Simon.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. You can move a little bit further forward.
Thank you once again. Welcome aboard. Use your nearest exit. Airline.
2020 marked a fundamental and ultimately fatal strategic inflection point for Rex. After nearly 2 decades of disciplined and profitable regional operations, the company embarked on a high-risk, high-stakes gamble to transform itself into a major domestic jet operator. The catalyst for all of this was the pandemic and the collapse of Virgin Australia in April of 2020.
Virgin Australia has just gone into voluntary administration.
Within a month of this occurring, in May of 2020, Rex's management pitched a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to investors. Codenamed Project Mother, a name supposedly given because Mother is the opposite of Virgin, this was a plan for the airline to expand aggressively into the domestic jet market. It's now 2025, and this clearly did not work. Rex went bankrupt and they're now in voluntary administration. But what went so wrong, and was this an inherently bad idea? The short answer is no. It was not an inherently bad idea, but it was based on incredibly optimistic assumptions and ignored many of the brutal realities of the Australian aviation landscape. Let's start with their incredibly optimistic assumptions. The core belief at the time was that Virgin Australia was going to go under, or at best be a weakened competitor for years to come. Their collapse into administration created a brief but genuine power vacuum. For the first time in 20 years, the cozy duopoly of the Australian skies was broken. The flow-on assumption here was that this would mean that there would be abundant slots available at all of the major capital city airports, and that it would be easy and cheap for Rex to get both planes and staff. Their final big assumption here was that $200 million would be enough capital for them to ride the losses until they hit the sort of scale required to operate a profitable domestic jet network. So what actually happened? Well, the big and obvious thing here is that Virgin didn't collapse. Bain bought them up and very quickly restored the domestic network. By mid-2022, they were back at pre-COVID levels. This meant that there wasn't this wave of free slots and gates at airports, and while a lot of the Virgin staff still had jobs, so they weren't easily hireable by Rex. The post-COVID inflation wave also meant that jets weren't cheap. If anything, it ended up being one of the most expensive times to try and launch an airline. That being said, they did try. They started flying on the 1st of March 2021, and they built up a domestic network that connected most of the major capitals. They grew their fleet up to 10 737s by late 2023. But that $200 million, well, they ended up raising $150 million from PAG, a large Asian investment firm. This was nowhere near enough, especially with them now having to go head-to-head with both Virgin and Qantas. Qantas didn't help them out here either. In a move that surprised absolutely no one, they executed their classic playbook for crushing a new competitor. Along with their budget attack dog Jetstar, they flooded the market with capacity and dropped prices in order to bleed Rex dry. One of their more effective and overlooked moves in this fight was their use of QantasLink, their regional subsidiary. They went on the offensive. They began launching flights on Rex's own, previously exclusive and highly profitable regional routes. Rex was burning money on all fronts. And on July 30th, 2024, the cash ran out. They entered voluntary administration, immediately grounding all 737s and returning them to the lessors. The regional Saabs kept flying on a caretaker schedule thanks to government support, basically lifeline services for country towns. Now, this whole saga can be interpreted in a few ways. I think most people are either going to go down the classic Qantas is evil line, or there's this they made a big bet on Virgin collapsing and it didn't pay off line. And whilst I think both are true to some extent, I think a lot of the damage was self-inflicted. They made a series of decisions internally that really crippled the airline from within. Let's start with the core regional business. Even before Project Mother, their aging fleet of Saab 340s were literally falling apart. Multiple safety incidents, including a propeller falling off mid-flight, has led to public scrutiny and parts of the fleet being grounded by regulators. By the time administrators walked in, almost half of the Saabs were grounded waiting for parts. Now, that's not just bad luck. That's a strategic blunder that occurs when you don't have a replacement plan. And that's the thing. Rex didn't. No one makes modern 30 to 40 seat turboprops anymore. They just aren't economically viable. Beyond a blue sky electric refit idea and a study with ATR, in practice, all they've been doing is buying more old Saabs to cannibalize for parts or swap into service. What was yesterday's perfect fit has become today's maintenance nightmare. Rex's management team also made a very strange move in 2022. They announced a plan to acquire National Jet Express for $48.2 million. This is a charter airline based in Perth that primarily operates fly-in, fly-out services for the mining industry. It was pitched mostly as a diversification play, but the structure of this deal was quite suspicious. In the media releases announcing the acquisition, the headline stated that Rex was acquiring 100% of National Jet Express. But on completion, half was immediately sold to the executive chairman, Lee Kim-hai, and his brother-in-law. That's a little bit sus, but if we fast forward to when Rex entered voluntary administration, their remaining 50% stake in National Jet Express has ended up being sold to, you can probably guess, Lim Kim-hai and his brother-in-law for a reported $12 million, significantly less than the original acquisition price. None of this is illegal, but it is generally a terrible look, and the original acquisition wasn't exactly a logical move when the airline was already in a questionable cash position. More generally, the management team's handling of governance and disclosure has raised a few eyebrows. Between 2020 and 2022, Rex was burning cash. They posted a $20 million loss in 2020, a $4 million loss in 2021, and then a blowout $46 million loss in 2022. But in February of 2023, they told the market that they expected to be profitable for that financial year. Beautiful. Maybe the plan was finally working. No. A few months later, in June 2023, they reversed that guidance and warned of a $35 million operating loss. The final audited result landed at a $31.7 million operating loss for financial year 2023. Was this just an accounting whoopsie or something a bit more questionable? Well, it was questionable enough for the Australian Securities and Investment Commission. On the 11th of December 2024, they sued Rex and 4 directors, alleging misleading guidance and continuous disclosure failures. Investors weren't given a clear, timely picture of the true financial state of the company. The bigger overall failure here, though, was the board's management of the failing jet business. Instead of making the tough decision to try and sell off the jet business or just close it down entirely and eat the losses, the board started in fighting. In June of 2024, Lim Kim-hai resigned as executive chairman, but just a mere month later, he moved to overthrow the entire board. All of this was happening while the 737s kept flying and cash kept burning. So I guess yes, Virgin didn't collapse and Qantas did fight hard, But Rex's downfall also came from inside. They had an aging fleet with no replacement plan, a tone-deaf acquisition mid-crisis, and a board that argued while the jet project probably needed to be quickly shut down. This all brings us to the future. Will Rex still be around in 5 years? I'm not sure if it was just because we were close to the ground, but it felt like we were taxiing really quickly here. If any pilots can tune in here, is there like a speed limit? I did some Googling and it seems to be about 20 knots is the standard speed, which is 37 kilometers an hour, but we were hitting upwards of 75 k's an hour. I don't know. Anyway. Back to our story, what's the future of Rex? Well, this all comes down to the government. Not in some wishy-washy, hand-waving, they'll influence the decision sort of way, but just more in the they have the literal deciding vote sort of way. In January of 2025, conveniently just before the upcoming federal election, the Australian government made the unprecedented move of buying $50 million of Rex's debt from PAG, making itself the principal creditor. In other words, they're now the ones that are technically owed the most money by Rex in bankruptcy, therefore their vote matters most in the restructuring process. So why is the government being so supportive of a failed airline? Well, on the surface, the answer is straightforward and politically sound. Rex is essential infrastructure. For dozens of small towns across Australia, Rex isn't just an airline, it's the only airline. They are a literal lifeline. If Rex were to disappear completely, the government would have a massive economic and social crisis on its hands in regional Australia. No government, whether it's Labor or the Coalition, wants to be the one that cut off the bush. With all of that being said though, Rex has had unusually good access to leaders of both major parties for their whole existence. This isn't really any hard evidence of any connections, we'll get to that shortly, but I do find it rather incredible that in this 10-year anniversary book created by Rex in 2012, if you go to page 4, we've got forewords written by Tony Abbott and Anthony Albanese. They were both just ministers at the time, but have since gone on to both be prime ministers. Rex had both sides of the aisle publicly blessing their origin story. But it wasn't just endorsements on paper. Rex, for pretty much its entire history, was super tight with the National Party. For years, they had former Nationals Transport Minister John Sharp as their deputy chairman, and their relationships in regional politics were deep and long-standing. During COVID, the Liberal National Coalition was in power. The transport portfolio sat with Nationals leader and Deputy Prime Minister Michael McCormack, who fronted the aviation rescue packages and pitched them squarely at keeping regional Australia connected. Now, we all think of Qantas as the one that received huge government handouts during COVID. And that's true, but proportionally, Rex may have gotten the best deal of anyone. Here's why. As part of the Commonwealth support package, McCormack created a $100 million fund for regional carriers, but he explicitly excluded QantasLink and Virgin Australia's regional arm, even though those two flew roughly 85% of regional capacity. Under this scheme, Rex received $53.9 million in untied cash, not a loan, not repayable, and not linked to any minimum flying requirements. For an airline with $321 million in 2020 revenues, that's quite a helping hand. That money didn't just save Rex from bankruptcy, it also gave management the confidence to launch jet services. Within months, they were talking up a once-in-a-generation opportunity and leasing 737s. Layered on top of the policy design were the optics. One of Rex's 737s flew with the registration VHMFM, widely read as a nod to Michael Francis McCormack. No official dedication, but as political theatre, the message was clear. We know who backed us when it counted. So there's kind of two truths sitting at this table. Yes, Rex is a vital lifeline for regional Australia, but they also enjoyed outsized support during COVID, likely thanks to their cozy political relationships. Why is Labor, the other side of the aisle, still supporting them? Because they have to. Cutting off the bush is political cyanide for any government, and the essential service argument is real. And where Rex lands in the future is still up in the air. The government has made it clear that they're looking to get a deal done. They want to sell off Rex, but this is a hard sell. They have an ancient fleet that's in dire need of significant investment, a scary proposition for any potential bidder. It's likely that the government will have to provide significant funding to help make this a possibility. With that being said, the government has also made it clear that they're open to nationalizing wrecks in the case that they're unable to find a suitable acquirer. I think this will be quite unlikely, but would be an incredible turn of events and harps back to the days of the Chifley government. We'll just have to wait and see on this one. I think it's clear here that the government is still standing with wrecks, and it's incredibly likely that they'll still be around in 5 years. Okay, this video was an effort. We are going back to sub 30-minute episodes next time. But anyway, I hope you learned something here. If you did, make sure to subscribe. I'm currently on a trip filming a bunch of new videos. You can follow along live on my Instagram here, and make sure you go and check out the Flight Formula website. Go subscribe to Wine Tracker Plus. I will see you all in the next one. Bye.
Simon? Is that Simon?
What's Simon?
And there's going to be no filming of the consumption of the sausage. No one ever looked good eating a sausage.